Okay. Um, this is, let's see, I posted a set of these in Canvas for you guys. They're just little quick 2-minute blurbs, but they're really handy in a bunch of ways. There's a bunch of ones on the different islands. Blue Hawaiian Helicopters did these, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or something like that. Um, from what I understand is they also have longer, like 15 or 20-minute ones that you can actually purchase if you go to their website, which are intended, I think, for probably folks that have flown on the chopper, and then sort of get a nice HD vision of your experience. But they're really sort of handy for several things. One is they're not bad visualizations of some parts of the Hawaiian landscape, though, as we'll see, what's missing is oftentimes more intriguing than what they're showing. But secondly, is you have to remember that Blue Hawaiian Helicopters, as with a huge number of services around here, is entirely oriented to the travel industry, to tourism. And so, when they figure out what they want to put in a 2-minute advertising blurb, because these things are on YouTube, they're posted, and what they want is they want people to watch this and, go, wow, when I go to Maui, I want to make sure I take Blue Hawaiian Helicopters. So these are advertising pitches. So what they choose to put in these is really interesting because it's a result of, they've been around here for, I think, like 30 years or something like that. So they've been around for a long time. They're very successful. They know what tourists want. And so when you watch these images for the different islands, they're really sort of interesting because it gives you sort of a visual encapsulation of the stereotypes that tourists have of Hawaii. You can get it in text, you can get it in maybe little, 30-second bites, but these are a little more interesting because they're island specific. And as I think I mentioned maybe sometime last week, one of the intriguing things about Maui is it's considered one of the most attractive tourist destinations in the world first. And it invariably comes up in the top 3 to top 5 in terms of when people have been there, they find it one of the most satisfying places. Maui traditionally has one of the highest rates of return visitors of any place in the world. So it's one of those places when people go to, they want to go back again. And as I pointed out last time, I think Oahu doesn't have that at all. In fact, the other islands don't have it near the same extent. Kauai a little bit, but the Big Island not really. So Maui really hits a bunch of buttons for tourists, and it does so in a way which basically means that it not only fulfills the stereotypes they have of Hawaii, but it fulfills them in such an attractive or compelling way that they actually want to do it again. And that's sort of unusual because tourism is usually the idea of novelty is a big part of tourism. So people go someplace and they see and they check it off their bucket list and then they go look for something different. The fact that Maui manages to sort of buck that trend is just really sort of interesting. So as we go through this, again, you can watch this. It should be a link in your Canvas, but I just wanted to go through it because there's some spots here that actually tie into other parts of the class. This is Waihe. So this is the northeast side of the island. And so this is back in the valley. What you see here when you're looking here is you see basically the collapsed edge. Here's your caldera edge here. Here's your lip over here. It's eroded away in the center here where the stream comes through, Waihe stream. Back here is the actual caldera of the West Maui volcano. In fact, this little section you see here is actually the flat of what's left of the sort of the base of the caldera. So what you're looking at here is sort of the classic eroded volcano. But like I said, Maui's sort of unique that the volcano really hasn't collapsed. The other volcanoes that are old are a lot harder to visualize because there's only pieces of them left. Another thing you notice here is notice the mist cloud formation caught on the ridge or the lip. This again, remember, we've gone through this a number of times. This is where a lot of your water comes from. It doesn't come in rainfall coming down. It comes in captured mist that then is basically, transmitted down the slope. For those of you interested in vegetation, West Maui is sort of interesting because on one hand, you have some significant aspects of traditional or endemic vegetation, especially on the high slopes. But a lot of this lower is going to be in a combination of staghorn fern, which is endemic. But a lot of the rest of this is going to be in guava and other exotics that have come in the last 200 years. So what this means, for example, traditionally in Waihe, you could walk up a path, and I can't remember, I've never been back this far in Waihe, I think it's on this side, and actually get into the center of the caldera. It's fairly easy access. But in the modern context of all the exotic vegetation, now this is pretty much impassable. Even you don't even find a lot of goats in here. I've talked to goat hunters and they say going in, it isn't worth the trouble of going in here. So what you get is this vegetation is not what Hawaiians would have seen 200 years ago. It would have been a lot more rock, it would have been a lot more bare. So ironically, some of the tourist stereotypes are, of course, of the beautiful green tropical environment are a reflection of exotic imports. They're not a reflection of the actual landscape that existed. And you can even go back to pictures of the late 19th century and look at, pictures of Waihe'i in the late 19th century, and you'll find that this is a lot more open. It's a lot more, you can visualize, you can actually see the rock landscape with trees and staghorns, but nonetheless a lot more accessible, which means it's a hell of a lot easier to walk in. So what you find now is this is sort of the contemporary view, but of course from the tourist experience, this is perfect because this is a lush tropical landscape, and it's not by accident when they're doing Hollywood movies that they do in landscapes like this, Kalalau, for example, or even Hanalei. So you can get that real Hawaiian, but sort of generic tropical landscape. So again, notice how your, whoops, so I can get back here. So that's what you've got here is now we're on the inside of the caldera. So you've got your slopes are actually known as capture. So they're capturing water, and water drains down and forms a mist. This is all your just myriad of waterfalls that comes down. You have to remember from the standpoint of sort of erosion, these things are doing a massively good job of cutting into the landscape. So these things are constantly cutting away at this lip of the volcano. And here you see the fall. All this is loose stuff. You never want to try to walk on this stuff. You'll break a leg in about 10 minutes. This is all loose material that used to be part of this wall. It's been brought down here by the erosion patterns of wind, but mainly water. I'm cutting into it and bringing down. Then of course it's going to grind into smaller pieces, eventually transport it down the stream. It's going to end up, in the ocean off of Waihe'i. So here you see the same thing. Here's your center caldera. Notice again the mist capture, which is generating the water that generates this waterfall. And again, notice what you've got here is you have to remember this volcano would have been another 10,000 feet higher. So what you're actually looking at is the internal skeleton. You're not looking at the original volcano, the size of the original volcano. You're actually like the inside of what the volcano was. And here's your harder material has survived, and the softer material has been eroded out by the water. And here you can see, here's your harder dike formation here. So the dike formations have survived. Everything that's softer, it's been cut out. This process is just ongoing, 24/7. Because it's mist capture, it's not dependent on rainfall coming in. Okay. Here you see part of what's actually a pretty traditional Hawaiian landscape. I'm not sure, this looks like my olivalisite, the drier side. But what you see here is a fair amount of this is actually indigenous vegetation, certain types of ferns and some grasses. What you see here is one of the classic, standard patterns of tree cover in Hawaiian forest environments, and that's the kukui, which tends to be in your lower areas. So you see something like this, and what that tells you from a forestry standpoint is a fair amount of the vegetation here is probably original. Now in this section here, this is probably guava. I'm not sure what else would be in here. This looks indigenous, but I'm not sure what tree that is. That might be kauhila. But what you've also going to have here is that with this erosion pattern, again, notice you've got the steep cuts here. This has all been cut away by this, again, mist capture coming down and basically cutting away the softer material, leaving these eroded valley systems. This is one reason why, if you go back to that very basic concept we covered at the beginning, the idea of Malka and Makai, just as sort of a hiking note, this is why in traditional Hawaiian terms, you almost never walked on ridges, because you can see if you start coming down this ridge, you're going to be dead. You're going to fall about 200 feet right here. There's no way to get off of it. Traditionally in the Hawaiian system, you walk on the lower side near streams. And you always head Malka to Makai, from upslope to downslope, unless you know what you're doing. So what you see here is sort of a classic valley situation in the Hawaiian Islands with the vegetation. Now notice from a tourist standpoint, this isn't near as attractive as the Waihe'i thing, because it doesn't have that sort of verdant, sort of stereotypically tropical green. Okay, here what you see is an ohia forest. So this would have been, this is your traditional ground cover. And actually West Maui is one of the best spots to find a fair amount of the traditional vegetation set. So what you'd find underneath this would be a ground cover of basically ferns of different sizes. And the ohia, and that'd pretty much be it. Doing this, you'd also find iliahi and kauila and your other Hawaiian sort of mixed forest. But your dominant tree species here would be ohia, and the ohia would actually be all the way down to the shore. So anywhere from about 5,000–6,000 feet, which is this is about where this is, all the way down to the shore would have been this one sort of dominant tree species, going everywhere from a tall tree like it is here up to maybe 60 feet, down to the shoreline where it actually commonly looks like a bush. And again, notice the kukui in your lower elevations. You can notice your eroded spines. Okay, that's headed out to Olivalo. This is Olivalo Gorge. Again, right now, actually, unless I've had a lot of rain this weekend, this would be a fairly easy hike. This gives you an idea what a Hawaiian landscape looked like on all the islands and most of the area prior to exotic vegetation coming in. Olivalo gets a lot less rain in the access area, so you can see this sort of bare slopes is actually what all the Hawaiian islands would have looked like even on the wet sides. And here you see your classic sort of, Hawaiian mixed forest regime where there's water. Going out to the ocean here at Olivalo, Lahaina side. Okay, here's the rift zone on Halakala. Here's the summit, so your actual caldera is on the other side of that. This is the crack that goes all the way down to Kaho'olawe. So you can actually, it's probably one of the easiest spots in the Hawaiian Islands to visualize. You can just visualize this weak spot. You can actually connect the dots. And you can actually see the stress fractures that are still visible on the surface. And then what's happened is you had a series of ruptures and cinder cones off the side of this thing. And like I said, this is still a weak spot that's still expanding. Okay. Here's Halakala crater. But again, notice how this is actually filled. The crater is actually about 1,500 feet below that, the caldera. Here's the crack on the side. Here's the Kaupo gap. So if you visualize, here's your lip of the caldera. The lip of the caldera went right around here. And when this secondary eruption sequence started, eventually what happened is that huge amount of hot material burned a hole or blew a hole, we're not sure which, in the side of the caldera collapsed and all this stuff poured out. So you can just visualize like a cracked bowl or cracked bucket. And here's the crack and then just dumped down. So this sheets down all over the southeast side of the island of Maui as the Kaupo gap, which is a really accurate description of it. But notice the cinder cones that you're looking at here from the secondary eruption sequence. In fact, you realize this actually looks a lot like that external eruption because it's part of the same sequence. Here you can see the old original side of the volcano. And notice the difference in the texture and type of material and what you see in the center. So you can actually, it's pretty easy to visualize this as fill. And here's the edge of the crack. Here's where the gap happened. This is Halakala on the east side, again, the erosion sequence. So this is older, this is the older volcanic material. For one thing about not having many tourists around, we haven't lost anyone, I don't think, this year at the pools. This is your wet side rainforest. About 60% of this is exotic. This stuff all here is exotic. I can't remember what the name of that stupid vine is. So everything that's lower here is exotic. This originally would have been ferns, but here you can still see, you still have your ohia cover. Your top cover is still ohia. So still remnants of the old forest, but the huge proportion of this is now exotic. People are always drowned in it here, else the idiots try to dive off the side of these things in lower pools. The lower pools are only about 10 feet deep, so that doesn't work very well. The Hana High Chiefs used to have this as a whole area was kapu. They were seen as a relationship, probably with Kamapuaa, but it's not really too clear because water is also seen as a mole thing. So this particular area was kapu to the High Chiefs of the Hana side of the island. But notice your mixed vegetation forest here. Okay, so it gives you a little bit of visualization. Now in that context, if you notice what was missing in that video was people. There are no people, there were no goats, there were no cattle. If you look at the one on the Big Island, what you'll find is ranching becomes a big theme. So if you're looking at the videos in the Big Island, just like those house ads we saw, it's the idea of the ranch, the Hawaiian ranch becomes a big deal. The image of Maui doesn't include ranching. The tourism image of Maui includes, verdant grain rainforest and spectacular visual, aspects of nature, which you can actually do on all the islands, but on Maui that fits part of the stereotype of the place. Maybe wake up. Now, Maui pretty much, as I think I sort of finished up with last time, Maui pretty much falls off the chart in the late 19th century. Once Lahaina drops out of dominance as sort of the other big seaport in the Hawaiian Islands, and sugar starts to come in, Maui initially has a lot of trouble. The areas like over here, Pioneer Mill, for example, turns this whole section from Kapalua down through here into sugar. I have a few sugar plantations here, a few over here. But the problem with most of Maui is this whole center section is actually very, very dry. There's actually very little water that comes in here. In fact, whenever you fly into Maui, you notice this, because when the planes come in here, all of a sudden the wind just honks up because you've got these two mountain systems, and it ends up as a Venturi effect. So this area ends up with, it doesn't get a lot of rain first, and because of the Venturi effect, the water evaporates really quickly. You also, because all this is largely coral underneath here, is when it rains, the water just disappears in the coral. So basically for sort of sugar plantation agriculture, this place, if you could get water to it, this place was great for agriculture. But the problem is there wasn't a lot of water. In fact, if you notice here, there's almost no streams. The streams all drain off this side, and the streams over here drain this way. And so it pretty much stayed that way until two guys came over in the I don't know, you'd have to Google them. I can't remember when Alexander Baldwin came to Maui. I'm just going to say 1860. I could be wrong. And what they did is they looked at this and they realized, one, that if they could figure out how to get water here, they could make a ton of money. And secondly, is they realized that if they could figure out how to get water here and they wanted to be smart about it, the first thing you want to do is you want to get somebody to back you, basically invest with you. And what you do is you want to buy this land before you have the water, because it's not worth much. It's just sort of dry, near desert. And you just tell people, we're going to build a ranch there, and people think you're sort of nuts because there's no water there. So you want to make sure you buy this up when it's really cheap. So what they do is, by virtue of both a combination of purchasing land and also adverse condemnation, adverse possession, they acquire basically everything from here, pretty much all the way over to here, and all the way over towards Ma'alaya side. So all this basically ends up as Alexander Baldwin land. What they then do is they go to the monarchy, and they basically say, okay, we've got this huge investment. This should sound familiar. We're going to provide jobs, which should ring a bell. And what we need is the monarchy to allow us to tap the extra water in this part of the island. And the argument was, by the late 19th century, with the decrease in the total population, is that a lot of this water, in their view, in the Western view, the water was just, raining up here in the mountain and just draining out to the ocean. That was like a waste. You have to remember, this environmental consciousness was not part of the world back then. And so what they basically said is we want the monarchy to give us permission to basically put little dams up here and then run a big water diversion scheme, basically run pipes to run that water over to here. We'll pay for the diversion system, but we want control of the water that goes into the pipes. Now, the monarchy said, yeah, because one, there wasn't a lot of people over here, and two, the monarchy wasn't Maui based, so they didn't really care particularly what the folks over in this part of Maui thought anyways. This part had never been particularly pro-monarchy, so in some ways they probably thought, fine, go for it, you guys. Now, initially, of course, the agreement was what they were going to do is take what was called excess water. So they were still supposed to leave about 50 or 60% of the water to drain down the ocean. The folks in the monarchy weren't stupid. They realized that you have to have the water going down these streams because your opie and your other fish, a lot of the fish species actually are brackish. So a lot of your saltwater species, even some of the pelagic deep water ones, actually come inshore, they breed, they spawn just like salmon do up in the streams, and then the fry go back down into this area, and then the fry go back out in the ocean when they're a little bit larger. So the streams were a hugely important part of the maritime or marine life cycle for a lot of the marine biota. And the monarchy was very aware of this. There were really strict monarchy rules about not messing too much with streams, especially making them muddy. because that would ruin this. So the monarchy made it very clear, okay, you guys can take the water, but you can't interfere with this process. And you also can't take the water that the farmers that are still over here are using for their wet field, low systems, their wet field crops. And Alexander Baldwin went, okay. And at least initially, they actually abided by that, because now all of a sudden they literally had millions of gallons a day that they basically could then put into this area here. So Alexander Baldwin becomes Maui Land and Pine, or the two are related somehow. And basically they turn this area into one of the world's largest sugar production areas. Now the land on Maui was the last functional sugar production area right into 2014. I don't remember when they called the Pune Meltdown. Anyway, something like that. 2010 something. And the reason is because of the peculiar combination of soil on top, coral and sand underneath, and the irrigated water. This was actually, and probably if they had it running, this is actually the most productive sugarcane land in the world. You can get more sugar per plant per year here than anywhere else on planet Earth. It's just absolutely perfect conditions. Now, what this meant, among other things, is also Alexander Baldwin was worth more than God. I mean, they were just worth $1 gazillion. And these were just incredibly productive areas. Now, because ironically they were incredibly productive, it meant that you could grow 2 crops of sugar. Well, sugar takes about 5 to 6 years. Here you could grow it in about 4 to 5. So they were constantly rotating the sugar, which means they constantly needed more water. So pretty soon they started to ignore the regulations of the monarchy. By now we're getting into the Republic. And Alexander Baldwin, by 1890, 1900, owns the island of Maui. They're by far the biggest moneymaker on the entire island. As I think I might have mentioned when we were talking about land ownership, they very quickly get sort of embedded in the territorial government. They weren't involved in the overthrow, but they supported it. So when we become a republic for 5 or 6 years, they make very, very clear that they're going to run Maui. So basically from like 1895 to 1941, the Alexander and Baldwin families run the island. And their sugar production runs the island. You have your ancillary things, which would be your ranches and stuff like that. But this is the big players, A and B. And so what they do is they now that they control everything, they no longer feel any need to basically abide by the restrictions that they'd agreed to under the monarchy, and they start to take more and more of the water from the streams here. By the early 20th century, a lot of the streams aren't running to the ocean anymore. A and B is taking the entire water outflow and diverting it to their operations in central Maui. They then put in a second pipe, which basically runs this way, called the Kula pipe, because they want to turn this upper area into pine and such like that. And they've already got this diversion system down there is being used. So they actually tap some of the other valleys here that they hadn't tapped too much. And they run this thing right down the side of Halakala over into the Kula area to basically irrigate their upper sections in what's called, sort of middle Kula. And so by the 1910, 1920 period, basically a huge proportion of the water in one of the wettest parts of the Hawaiian Islands is being diverted to one of the drier parts of the Hawaiian Islands, all under the name of one company. Now, where it gets very complicated is sort of 2 things, and this is a situation that still persists right down. In fact, I'll think if I can find it, I'll actually put it as a link to your Canvas stuff. You end up in a situation where on one hand, we'll say by 1920, Alexander and Baldwin has spent millions. In fact, in modern terms, it'd probably be a couple of $100 million putting this enormous water diversion system that basically diverts water over here to their operations here. They also then sell some of that water to the county of Maui, which then provides water for folks in Makawao, Kahului, and stuff like that. So they're on one hand, they're a private company, but they're also providing water to the general population, which means from the territory standpoint, from the county standpoint, it means the county doesn't have to do those services. The folks over here are upset because now what's happening on the water. A lot of the farmers have to leave this area because there's not even enough water to water their low patches. The entire stream's dry before it gets down to the agriculture systems down here. And when they complain, it's to an Alexander or Baldwin judge in a county run by an Alexander or a Baldwin. And so they just look at them like, what's your problem? The other thing that you get into in this entire system is that under the monarchy, water belongs to everyone. You can't own water. And so you end up in this very complicated situation. Alexander and Baldwin and the monarchy said that they didn't own water, they owned the water transport system. So it's like they don't own the water in the pipes, but they own the pipes the water's in. They don't own the water in the streams, but they own the dams. And with the monarchy, that sort of skating the law worked, because everyone was sort of, in a common attitude that better use the water than just let it, whatever. By the 1920s, 30s, this becomes more complicated. As the population start to increase, you start to end up with water shortages. And of course, Alexander and Baldwin's going to make sure you might not have been able to take a shower in Kahului, but they're going to sure as hell make sure they have water for their plants because it's their pipes. In the 1970s, 1980s, water ownership and the legality of this becomes a much bigger issue. It's an enormous issue here in Hawaii in the 21st century. And a lot of these decisions have been made on Maui with this same system, the Alexander and Baldwin water diversion system. Because when we become a state in 1959, all this falls under the Department of Land and Natural Resources, which if you think about it, water is one of the natural resources. And you have to remember that both sides are right. It's one of those situations on one side, the water belongs to everyone. The water should be able to flow out in the streams the way it does naturally, so the farmers can use it and it goes out here, and the fish stocks can replenish and breed, etc. On the other hand, Alexander and Baldwin points out, and they're legitimate from a Western standpoint, that they spent millions and millions of dollars over the last 100 years putting in the system to make sure that people have drinking water, et cetera, in Maui. And therefore, at some point, if you can't arbitrarily suddenly change the law and leave them holding the bag, not only for suddenly a water system which they can't use, but all of a sudden now this turns back into near desert. And so you basically have ruined them as a private company because you decide to reinterpret the law, which is true because you have to remember everything they did was legal. Most of it. And so this is the nightmare that the 20th, 21st century brought into the whole thing, especially the 21st century. And this is true of both Maui and it's also true of Oahu. This is the water system diversion system that's run by Castle and Cook here on Oahu. And on Maui, or on Sitsa and Kauai. This is the Grove Farm system down in southwest Maui, or Kauai. But the biggest one is the one on Maui, simply because you end up with frequent water shortages on Maui. And of course, in the 21st century, well, 20th and 21st century, a lot of your population growth has been here. And if you visualize a lot of those sort of large ranch estate things, a lot of them are very water dependent. Of course, your resort systems, especially here in this part of Maui, are incredibly water dependent. So what you do is you've increased the amount of consumption of water radically. But a lot of that consumption is occurring in the very same areas that are short in the sense they don't have natural water, because those have the same type of sun, sand attraction that makes dry areas attractive to tourists, because they can pretty much guarantee if they go there, it'll be sunny out. You're not going to find someone building a huge resort over in Hana because it would be like Turtle Bay. It's too wet. It's just not going to be attractive, or Hilo. Now, what you also find is that when you're looking at these resort areas and their use of water, and it's something sort of striking to sort of think about for a second. Maui has the greatest number of golf courses and acres in golf, whatever you want to call it, of any place in the world on its land area. Basically, a huge proportion of the land up here from above Kapalua all the way down here to Wailea Makena is in golf courses. It's a staggering amount of land. Almost all of it's on very dry land, and almost all of it is only fed by virtue of irrigation. And until 4 or 5 years ago, none of it was using gray water. So it was all using the same water. So you end up in a situation that the water that was here can either be used for a farmer here. It can be used to go down to keep the ecosystem intact, or it can be used to water someone's lawn or wash their car or raise cattle on this part of the island, or it can be used to water a golf course, which seems sort of manini, but on the other hand, that golf course attracts tourists, which generates a lot of income, which we don't have right now in October. So all this stuff sort of becomes the problem is it's one bucket of water. So who gets what part of that bucket of water? This is one of the enormous issues in Hawaiian legal arguments today, especially Hawaiian land law. There's been a bunch of decisions in the last 2 years on water access and water usage, and DLNR has gotten smacked from every group because at some point it's their choice, their call. And pretty much they managed to make no one happy. Though they've tended to bend over backwards for the old owners. Now, one of the fascinating aspects, as we'll see, is that Alexander and Baldwin is using their control of water to basically not quite, I wouldn't say quite blackmail, but certainly leverage the choices they want to make with all this property they still own here, because now it's not in sugar anymore. And so their argument is pretty much, well, since we control the water, here's what we want to do with this property. And everyone's saying, well, you know, you don't control the water. And one of their arguments has been, fine, if we don't control the water, we're just going to open up the dams and let it wash off here, and you guys aren't getting any drinking water by tomorrow morning. So it's a very complicated situation. There's one of those situations where everyone's partially right. But we'll see this a little more, but this all occurs, this is all built 100 years ago. In fact, over 100 years ago, in some cases 130 years ago. And you see this with the other islands too. The water diversion systems are old, they're over a century old. They made a ton of money for the people that made them, but they also spent a ton of money making them. They put in miles and miles of tunnels and pipes and all sorts of other stuff at huge expense. And you know, they've made a lot of money out of it. So one can certainly argue they got their money back. But you end up in a complicated situation that a lot of your development has actually been in the same areas, in some cases encouraged by them. Alexander and Baldwin has put most of the subdivision developments over here in Waikapu side, and that intentionally uses their water. Castle and Cook, of course, have built the whole area of Mililani and Mililani-Maukop, and that's using their diversion water on Oahu. So to a certain extent, they very cleverly have manipulated their controlled water systems for their corporate benefit, even in the 21st century, but they've also put everyone over a barrel. If you suddenly say, okay, you know, the county's going to take over Maui's water, then Alexander and Baldwin literally would just walk from the system and tell the county, fine, you figure out how you're going to get the water over to all the people here that are now thirsty. How are you going to water the golf courses? And of course, it would take probably 10, 20 years for that to happen. It would cost billions of dollars to actually make the system go. So it's one of those areas where the private sector was able to get away with stuff in the 19th century because there weren't a lot of people on the landscape, and because what they were offering was jobs in areas that did not have attractive alternative jobs. So they were able to get away with things that were sort of marginal, but they built up the infrastructure, but the infrastructure was all private. The infrastructure was not public. And the problem is what it was transporting was public, i.e. water. Huge issue in the Hawaiian Islands. If you ever got involved in environmental issues, sooner or later, in my view, every environmental issue in the Hawaiian Islands involves water somewhere along the line. And Maui's the poster child of that. Now, what happens is not surprisingly by the late 19th, early 20th century is the plantations who were depending on rainfall became dependent or started to become dependent on this water system that was available from the plantations. Because to a certain extent, if you're one of the big ranches, Ulapalakua, Halakala and such, the number of cattle you actually had on your land was limited by water more than it was by grass. And of course, if you had more water, that meant that you could actually do at least, you know, some watering, some sprinkling or whatever, or that it increased the actual grass yield, which meant you could have more cattle. So the ranches were able to expand because they were cutting or started, you know, catching some of this water from the plantation diversion systems. But what that also meant is the plantations, as the ranches started to expand, now they became dependent on the plantation system also. I think this is where the light bulb sort of went off in the plantation owners' heads. I think prior to this, they'd sort of figured they were diverting the water for sugar or maybe pineapple. So they're pretty much using it for ag. I don't think it really dawned on them what the ancillary sort of side benefits were until the ranches got involved and sort of said, hey, could you run a pipeline over here? And all of a sudden the ranches were able to expand. They made more money. And I think then the plantations realized that there was probably as much money in the water as there was in the sugar or pineapple. But by the 1920s, 1930s, the ranches were very, very aware, or I should say the plantations were very, very aware that their money was probably actually in the water monopolies they had. It really wasn't in the sugar or the pineapple. And this could explain why in the early, you know, by the 1930s and 40s, they're not quite as freaked out about the plantation shutting down. They hate it, and they try their damnedest to keep them alive. But I think they already realized as the population was increasing on the islands, as you got more suburbs, you got more urbanization taking place, as tourism started to pop up in the 50s and 60s, they realized as long as they can control the water, they don't really have to have sugar. Water is where their money is. So the whole thing sort of shifts in terms of where their interests are. Just as a weird sort of trivial pursuit. Let's switch back over here. Sort of a little story that gives you some idea of how globalized this entire process was. So you have to visualize, if you're Alexander and Baldwin, you sit there and you grow your sugar here on Maui. You sit there and then you harvest the sugar. So you take it to the Punene or the Paia mills or something like that. And so the sugar's processed. It's turned into raw sugar, which is what you guys buy like health food stores, the crystalline brown sugar. You then pack that into huge bales of about 100 pounds. You put those on ships and then sail those to the mainland. There were never any sugar refineries here. And the reason was very simply that there was no point in shipping. Sugar refineries are fairly expensive. And shipping the sugar really didn't make any sense. It made just actually more sense to ship the raw sugar, because raw sugar, one of the sugar guys explained this to me once, raw sugar ships better. It still has molasses and stuff in it, which is why it tastes so much different than white sugar. And so it actually ships better. So if you're going to put something in a burlap bag and ship it, you really want to ship raw sugar. So they ship the raw sugar, and where they ship it to is here. Let's see if this will show up. I don't know if there's still a Sprinkles in California. No, I guess not. Ship it over to, I don't remember exactly where it is, somewhere up in here. They ship it to a spot here in Northern California, in San Francisco Bay. I'm just going to arbitrarily, I think it's right near Martinez. And it was actually called Sprecklesville. Was actually run by a guy named Spreckles, who was the big white sugar producer. So basically, he took this raw sugar in and he turned it into white sugar, which is what you buy. He had a company called California Hawai'i Sugar. It was actually originally in conjunction with the Alexander and Baldwins. And so all the sugar grown in the Hawaiian Islands, all was packed on boats, and it all went, we'll just say, I can't remember, somewhere around here. They said it all went to here. And there it was turned into those pink and white bags of sugar called Hawaii or California Hawai'i or Hawaii California, CNH, California Hawai'i Sugar, which was owned by Spreckles. So he did sort of the back end of the operation. He sort of wholesaled the sugar into its final form, and that's what people consumed. And since your main market was the United States, especially the western part, then it made sense to have the refinery here, because then you could just, with trains and trucks and whatever, you could ship it, to all your major markets in the United States. So that's where the Hawaii sugar went. Hawaii sugar was never actually refined in the Hawaiian Islands. Now, I don't remember exactly when, and I'm sure you can find this stuff. There might be articles even in Thrums. Somewhere in the I can't remember when, somewhere, I'm going to say mid-1870s, Spreckles, Klaus, I think his name was Klaus Spreckles, and Alexander and Baldwin got pissed off at each other. I'm sure it had to be over money, in terms of what they were going to pay or what he was going to pay him. And so what he basically decided to do is he decided that he wasn't going to pay their fees for the sugar. Somehow he had access to water on his own. I don't remember how. And so what he did is he actually, even though he was the white sugar guy, is what he did is he actually moved part of his operation. In fact, he even moved to Maui for a while. He set up his own sugar plantations here, and the Paia mill was part of it. And that became, in fact, that still exists. This is Sprecklesville in Maui. He named it this exactly the same as his town in California where the big sugar refineries were. And so he built this little community here. He had a bunch, he owned basically all this area here was owned by Spreckles, including where the airport is now. And he set up his own competing plantation with Alexander and Baldwin. This lasted for a little while, but somewhere along the line, what he had forgotten when he tried to expand is the water was controlled by A and B. So they would just sit there and flip the switch on and off on him, so he couldn't make a go of it. So he eventually gave up and sold back to them. But it gives you some idea of how much a family could control the power of an island in the 19th, 20th century, that they basically could chase their opposition away. And Spreckles was worth, he was a gazillionaire. I'm not sure what he was worth, but basically you figure he was selling all the sugar you consumed on the West Coast, all the way to the Midwest. It was all in pink and white sugar packages. It was all his. He was worth a ton of money. And yet when it came to that, by the time he was trying to set up shop, Alexander and Baldwin had already come to the conclusion by controlling the water, they controlled basically, everything except when you woke up in the morning, went to sleep on Maui. And they just basically shut his operation off. He sued them. And it was a huge mess for the monarchy because they weren't sure, the monarchy itself wasn't just too sure what side they should play. Alexander and Baldwin were never huge fans of the monarchy. They figured it interfered too much with their commercial operations. They really disliked Kalakaua because he used to be Kalakaua was real close to your ranchers, especially the Palakua Ranch. He used to spend a lot of time down here and didn't have a lot of time for the plantations because he was very upset with the amount of water they were starting to steal above and beyond what they were supposed to have. So there was a lot of tension between the plantation owners, both Alexander and Baldwin on Maui, and especially Castle and Cook on Oahu, with the monarchy itself. They weren't involved in the overthrow per se, but they backed the overthrow. And when we became a republic in 1893, they immediately jumped in with both feet, and pretty much Castle and Cook ran Oahu, Alexander and Baldwin ran Maui, and into the territorial period that just stayed the same. So to a certain extent, their control of water led them to largely a position of not only management, but also government control. And in the case of Maui, what that meant, as in the case of the Big Island with the plantations, is that, power was generated by the plantations, water was given to you by the plantations. So they pretty much, whatever was happening on Maui, they in this part, and then Pioneer Mill over here, which is part of Hackfeld's operation, pretty much defined everything that was going to happen on the island of Maui, with the exception of this part. These folks over here, their water was never diverted per se. And Alexander and Baldwin ran their diversion system through here, but they really didn't have anything to do with Hana. They also didn't have anything to do with this section up here on Honokawai side. So these two little sections here are pretty much outside of the political economic control system that was run by Alexander and Baldwin on Maui. The Big Island, we don't see this because, of course, the plantations weren't as large. Parker Ranch didn't have a dominant control of resources. Maui's the first of which is true of the other islands, where you find one or two companies have control of water and the prime agricultural land, and they do the things together. And what that gives them is almost an untouchable control of that particular island. One of the side effects of this, and Maui, you see this again more than you're going to see it on say, the Big Island, is you get a lot of your plantation patterns or a lot of your habitation patterns become reflective of plantation villages. So, of course, Lahaina already existed, but if you go up the road beyond Lahaina, you go to Kaanapali and stuff, those are actually all villages. In fact, let's see, we should be able to see this. So here you see several things. One is you see this enormous dependency on water in an area that basically doesn't have a lot of water unless it's brought in. So you can see sort of the environmental implications. Notice what it looks like when you don't have irrigation system running. Now, all this was irrigated. So every section here that's all dried out had water brought in from the other sides and stored in these large reservoirs, which then was then diverted out to all these fields. So the water systems here in Hawaii were incredibly sophisticated and reflective of these patterns of sort of usage. Let's see if we can find one here. It's sort of hard to show. There used to be. Okay, well, here it is here. God, it's buried in a golf course now. Okay. Actually, this section here, Kaanapali, was actually two small plantation towns, plantation villages more accurately. There was another plantation village here. There was another one up here. And even into the 1980s, God, it's all gone. That's scary. Jesus. Those don't look like plantation houses to me. I don't know where it went. Supposedly they're supposed to keep that plantation village intact. It was like the Eva plantations. But I think they sort of gone poof, and they disappeared. Huh. Wow. Okay, that's rather depressing. That's illegal, but it happens. So what you had is you had 4 plantation villages here. This is all Pioneer Mill property, AMFAC. And so what they did is 2 things take place. One is in the 19th and 20th century, this is all in sugar production. You can see the sugar production. And what you had in your coastal areas were clustered little hamlets, little chunks of people who worked different parts of the plantation. So you'd have your plantation villages scattered out so that basically these people could walk to where they had to work. Because you weren't going to transport them. You didn't put them in trucks and drive them around. You only had them hike up the hill. So if you're going to work here, they only walked up there every morning. So that becomes your plantation system. Now, in the mid-late 20th century, when we start to get tourism enclaves, and Kaanapali is the second. The Mauna Kea starts up in the Big Island. AMFAC, who already has shut down operations for sugar here, basically this whole area is just now marginalized. It's just sugar. They still got the entire population here is out of work, basically, because the only thing that was in operation was the mill, and it's shut down then. And so what you had was basically everyone trying to figure out how to make ends meet, and they decide they're going to copy the Mauna Kea logic, and you set up the first of your, I should say, the second of the tourism enclaves, and probably the one that's more reflective of what becomes the norm here in Hawaii. So you turn this area into a set of 3 hotels. You build your golf courses on the Mauka side, and then what you have is a few residences initially. But the idea, the main part of this is this little section here, which is Whalers, I think it's Whalers Village, yeah, Whalers Village. So what you do is you basically set up hotels. People can use the beach. They can go here and buy stuff in the shops, and they can play golf, and they never have to leave Kaanapali. Now, they were close enough to Lahaina. For some reason, people wanted to go down here and experience, Front Street in its 20th century incarnation. And they could do that, but the attitude is they wouldn't have to. And so this becomes like the Mauna Kea on the Big Island, which actually was physically isolated by 15, 20 miles of fresh lava. Here what you do is you isolate it by virtue of providing all your amenities in a package. And this becomes the Turtle Bay. This becomes, all the rest of your resort systems on the islands are sort of mirrored copies of this one. Now, what AMFAC does rather cleverly is they realize they get 2 things with one time. One is they now have this area turned into something that's going to make money rather than unproductive sugar land, since they're not doing sugar anymore. Secondly, is they've got a captive population base that was working the plantations. They now basically tell them, hey, guess what? You're going to be working in the hotels. You're going to be groundskeepers, whatevers. And so you provide jobs, which keeps the county and the territory or the state off your back, because now you're providing jobs for the locals. You're also using the water that your diversion system has brought in. Pioneer Mill's water diversion system is from up here in the West Maui Mountains. So they divert all the water down to here to the various reservoirs. But of course, by the 1960s, 1970s, the water was in the reservoirs, but to keep the pressure down, they were just letting the water run off through pipes into the ocean. So on one hand, they weren't sharing it with anyone else, but they were just not using it. So there wasn't any water, and these streams are still totally dry. So these streams are totally, in fact, you can see there's absolutely no water in the stream. At the same time, there's tons of water in the reservoirs. So you've completely messed with whatever was left is sort of the traditional water system coming down here. That's one reason why this is so barren. It's simply because nothing gets to the ocean, which means if nothing gets to the ocean, then of course your entire breeding cycle for opine and other stuff like that is not happening. In fact, if you notice, there's actually no visible way for it to get to the ocean, it just stops. So that's, that was one of the side effects of all this. But by virtue of suddenly needing a lot of water, you need water for the swimming pools, you need water for the golf courses. And now meant that they had a use for the water, which meant when someone was going to complain, oh man, you got all this water and you're not using it here. You go, oh yeah, no, we're using it. See, we need it for all this, and we're providing jobs. So the tourism industry and tourism enclaves of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s justified the plantation control of water. Even though by then they'd shut down sugar production in Maui, except for Maui land and pine in the center part. Sugar production, I think, in Pioneer Mill stops. Well, I started doing work there in 1975, and it just stopped by then. So I'd say late 60s, maybe. I'm not sure when Pioneer Mill actually shuts down. So what you get is basically the plantations turn this into a new version of a plantation. They use the workforce that had been on the plantations as the workforce for the tourism industry. They build these systems up, and to a certain extent using their expertise. You know, if you know how to grow sugar here, it's pretty easy to figure out how to grow grass for a golf course. So they use a lot of the same expertise. They've already got the water systems and control of water in place to divert it. They just diverted a different direction, and boom, now they've got a great new way to make money. It's a lot less subject to, you know, world sugar prices and politics than it was before. So most of your plantation owners, the really big ones, don't go out of business. They change business. They go from being sugar-based or pineapple-based to tourism-based, and or subdivision residence-based, which is what you see especially here on Oahu, but Maui is another good example. So they shift their focus, but they make sure they keep control of the water. Okay. Okay, that's pretty much all I need to cover today. Any questions on all that? If you ever want to get involved in anything here in Hawaii, water and control of water's the center of it. On almost every other environmental issue, sooner or later you're going to find yourself dealing with water. There was actually some sort of a presentation that was done on water control in Maui. If I can find it, I'll send you the links. I think they also did a video. So I'll see if I can fish it up this morning. You'll see some new stuff show up in Canvas, which gets you some better visualizations of how extensive these water systems are. Mind-blowing. The size of them is actually stunning, and the complexity is stunning. I can't remember how many people Castle and Cook have working on the water system here on Oahu, but it's a major business in its own right. And now, of course, it's becoming complicated because a lot of that system is now 130, 140 years old. So it's getting a little sketchy.